Thanks for staying with us, everyone, on the program. We're staying in the U.S., where the Pentagon has released its 2026 National Defense Strategy, which says the United States no longer views China as a top security priority. In a break from a decade of foreign policy that saw China as the biggest threat to U.S. security and economic interest, President Trump's administration now seeks to focus on the Western Hemisphere. The Pentagon document says relations with China will now be approached through strength, not confrontation. It also says U.S. allies and partners, such as South Korea, must shoulder their fair share of the burden of collective defense. This is in line with President Trump's call on U.S. allies in Europe and the Asia-Pacific to boost their defense towards countering security threats from Russia and North Korea. The Pentagon document notes that the U.S. military will be guided by 4 central priorities, which are defending the homeland, pushing allies around the world away from reliance on the U.S. military, strengthening defense industrial bases, and deterring China, as opposed to the policy of containment. And joining me from the nation's capital to discuss these developments is a retired U.S. Captain, Bishop Johnson. Good to have you join us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Precious. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Just fascinated by this latest document. I mean, a complete shift from previous administration, and it sort of reinforces the many of the military moves already been undertaken by the President Trump, especially the one we saw in Venezuela and the one he's now pushing for in Greenland. But let me just get your thoughts. You are a former captain in the U.S. Army. What do you make of this shift?
Well, we can call it a shift based on the fact that that is a break from what has been a traditional U.S. stance in terms of national defense and strategy. But it is not a break from Donald Trump's own doctrine. Donald Trump rode into office by America First agenda. And if you look at what is contained in his own national defense and national strategy document, it is in line with what he has said, that he wants to focus more on the United States and the Western Hemisphere. That was why you saw the United States go into Venezuela, because it's part of the Western Hemisphere. But Donald Trump is not the first person to share this kind of belief. If you have happened to have access to the Monroe Doctrine, it is Donald Trump's own doctrine is also in line with that Monroe Doctrine that seems to focus more on America, the Western Hemisphere, while encouraging Europe to concentrate more in their own domain.
He has now, well, interestingly changed it to the Monroe Doctrine, sort of mentioned his name, along with that of Monroe. But I also want to talk about this new strategy, especially as it has to do with American allies. President Trump is now in this document calling on allies to step up. He's saying that partners have been content to let Washington subsidize their defense. But more interestingly is the strategy also outlines a more limited role for U.S. deterrence of North Korea, saying that South Korea is capable of taking primary responsibility for that task. When it comes to dealing with terrorism around the world, it has been based on global cooperation. Now, what does this mean for that global security cooperation and deterrence?
Well, the global cooperation can only be effective when other partners are pulling their own weight. What is happening is that Donald Trump is beginning to make Americans realize what has already been obvious, that the U.S. cannot continue with the bogus defense budget that he has carried on for years. America cannot defend everywhere in the world. So it is time that the allies are able to pull their own weight. If you remember, before now, most of the NATO members were not even spending up to 2% of their GDP in defense budgeting. And so how can they defend themselves when they are making such commitment in defense spending? And so what Donald Trump is trying to do is to force all these people to be able to make enough investments in their own defense. You can see what is happening in Ukraine, see what is happening in Europe. Just by U.S. withdrawing its support for Ukraine, all of Europe is running around. They have not been able to sustain to fight back Russia as it was when Biden was in office and was providing most of the support for Ukraine. So what it is that it is very, very obvious that America cannot continue to spend and shoulder responsibility in carrying all of its allies, including South Korea and Europe. U.S. Annual budget, U.S. Total debt right now is over $30 trillion, and this is something that is going to have to be paid up. And this debt are ratcheted up through U.S. Excessive defense spending in trying to defend the homeland, the Western Hemisphere, and these allies of the United States.
And previous versions of this document, and I will get to, because you mentioned NATO, hopefully we'll have enough time to touch on that briefly, but I wanted to talk about China, which is also very interesting. Previous versions of this strategy, published every 4 years, had named the threat posed by China as the top defense priority. We saw that air balloon that I think it was circulating or flying over American air sometime, was it last year? And then I think it had to be shut down. There was one also, is it UK that also accused China recently of spying on his country? But Trump says China will now be approached through strength and not confrontation. I mean, how accurate is that?
Well, if you look at it, the U.S. needs to cooperate with China, trade with China, and also cooperate and collaborate with China to deal with some of the most global challenges that we face today. Being the second richest country,
I get that. Largest... Apologies for interjecting, but I get that. But is China less of a threat today to the U.S. than it was 4 years ago?
No, it is not less of a threat today as it was 4 years ago. But China is still far away from catching up with the United States, both economically and militarily. And so what the Donald Trump administration is saying is that, look, instead of us confronting China, we can deter China. It's not saying that China is no longer a threat. It is a threat, of course, with its vast economic resources, because you have to have economic resources to be able to have military might. And so with this vast economic resources, it's a threat. But China will still need at least 20 more years to be able to catch up with U.S. military strength and even catch up with the U.S. economy. And so what Donald Trump is saying is, look, within this time frame, we'll have to be able to push our allies to be able to pick up their own weight, because the U.S. will not be more adaptable, won't be more effective if it's pulling its own weight and pulling the weight of its own allies. U.S. will be more counter force to China if the U.S. is pulling its own weight and their allies are also pulling their own weight at the same time.
You were talking about NATO earlier. Does this shift in policy sort of signals a U.S. move towards isolationism? And what does that mean for NATO?
Well, I don't see an imminent danger to NATO because the NATO countries and the U.S. are too interconnected. If you look at some of the weapons and equipment that are being used by the U.S. and NATO, all of them are meeting the same standard. They're all interwoven. Some of the parts are coming from within NATO members. So it is very, very difficult for U.S. to decouple itself from NATO. But at the same time, U.S. has to emphasize that every NATO member must be able to spend their own fair share of defense, so that way, should there be a need for NATO to act, it will be much more, the weight will be much more easier for U.S. to carry, and then as against what is happening right now, where the U.S. is, shouldering, most of the responsibilities of NATO, because some of the members have not been able to spend enough money in investing in their own defense, particularly the countries in Europe. Like I cited earlier, you see what is happening in Ukraine. It is very, very very shocking that Europe, all of Europe combined, cannot provide effective military assistance and support to Ukraine, for Ukraine to be able to beat back Russia without United States support. It's very shocking. And so that is why Donald Trump is saying, look, you have to make enough investment in your own defense, not even in the defense of the U.S. Because when they do that, the job is lot more easier and lighter for the United States to be able to defend all of them.
Well, interesting development in terms of defense strategy in the U.S. We'll continue to follow up with that. Thank you so much for your time. As always, former U.S. captain in the Army, Bishop Johnson, a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
All right, finally, on the What Now, President Bola Tinubu has departed Abuja for a state visit to the Republic of Turkey. The visit is aimed at strengthening the existing cordial relations between the two countries and exploring further areas of cooperation in security, education, social development, innovation, and aviation. Special Advisor to the President on Information and Strategy, Bayo Noluga, confirmed that the President's engagement will include meetings between high-ranking officials and the signing of memoranda of understanding in scientific research, energy, technical cooperation, media and communications, military cooperation, and protocol, among others. Members of the President's entourage participating in the bilateral discussions include Minister of Foreign Affairs, Yusuf Tuga, Attorney General and Minister of Justice, Prince Lateef Fagbemi, Minister of Defense, retired General Christopher Musa, and Chairman House Committee on Defense, Jimmy Benson, among others. President Tinubu is expected to return to the country at the conclusion of the visit. And that's What Now. Thanks for watching. Now, for more updates on the international stories we're monitoring, you can visit our website, www.tvcnews.tv. You can also follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and on X at TVC News NG. We also have updates for you on WhatsApp and Telegram at TVC News Nigeria, on YouTube or live at TVC News Nigeria. I am Precious Amayu.